course, is one of the prophets. Prophets, of course, are very weird and strange people, typically people you don't want to be around. And this is true. Prophets are people that, they're the opposite of priests. Prophets are people that have heard something from God and then come and tell you, I have a message from God for you. And typically, we don't like those kinds of people. We think they're pretty strange. Priests, on the other hand, speak to God on behalf of the people. But when prophets come around, things get stirred up, change happens, we don't like it. Think of John the Baptist. What a weirdo. Out there in the desert, wearing weird clothing, eating weird things. And then people went out to hear weird things about how God was about to finally send the chosen Messiah. And there's a lot of weird things in the book of Isaiah. If you read through it, God asks him to do things, and he does it on behalf of God for the people. But prophets, of course, positively, actually reveal things to us that we, of course, would not have known, and we're grateful that they have scribbled it down in Holy Writ. And Isaiah is the chief of all the prophets in the Old Testament. And so we come to his highest, loftiest thoughts that God revealed to him again in Isaiah 53. But we will not start in Isaiah 53. Before I do that, a few more highlights of where we're headed. Sometimes Isaiah 53 is called the fifth gospel because we will be learning about Jesus 700 years before Jesus comes. Isaiah is written roughly 700 years before Christ. So to see Jesus in the Old Testament in such a profound and obvious way is, again, some people have called it like the fifth gospel. Martin Luther, the great reformer of the church, said every Christian ought to be able to repeat Isaiah 53 by heart. Pastor John Piper, a national known pastor here in the U.S., said, nowhere in all the Old Testament does the gospel of Jesus Christ shine more clearly than in Isaiah 53. So when you read the story of your salvation, that is essentially what we're going to be reading this morning is about the cross 700 years before it happened. You have not only revelation, but you have validation. Sometimes we ask ourselves, how can we know this is true? The scripture, God, what Jesus did on the cross for me. How about because it was prophesied 700 years before it happened? That's pretty good stuff. Now, we're going to not go straight into Isaiah 53. We're going to move ahead 700 years into the New Testament, into the book of Acts. We're going to look at one little scene from the book of Acts, which Acts, of course, is the beginning of the church, right after Jesus' ascension. And we have this wonderful story that, of course, is going to talk about Isaiah 53 and get us ready to go into Isaiah 53. So Acts chapter 8. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, go south to the road, the desert road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. So Philip started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian eunuch. So some high official from Africa. This man had gone to Jerusalem to worship. And on his way home, he was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. And oh, by the way, the reason why it says the book of Isaiah the prophet and it doesn't say Isaiah 53 is because there were no chapters and verses back then. It wasn't until 1300 that some guy in a carriage was riding across Europe and said, you know what? We really could use some chapters and verses to find all this stuff a little bit easier. So I forget his name, but it was around 1300. That's where we get our chapters and verses, which is really helpful. Verse 29, the Spirit told Philip, go to that chariot and stay near it. Then Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading from Isaiah 53. It's a wonderful scene. You just see Philip running along. How's it going? I know you don't know me. I hear what you're reading out loud there. You understand what you're reading? Do you understand what you're reading? How many times have you been reading the Bible and you're like, I don't get this. Well, I sure wish someone would explain this to me. And good old Philip, running alongside the Ethiopian eunuch. And so the Ethiopian replies, how can I? Unless someone explains this to me. This is tough. So he invited Philip up to sit with him. And this is the passage that the Ethiopian man was reading from. It's Isaiah 53. He was led like a sheep to the slaughter. And as a lamb before its shearer is silent, so he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation, he was deprived of justice. Think of Jesus' trial. Who can speak of his descendants where his life was taken from the earth? The eunuch asked Philip, tell me, is the prophet talking about himself or someone else? What's going on here? So then Philip began with that very passage and told him the good news about Jesus. Now we will go to Isaiah 53 to read it when it was first written 700 years before Christ. Who? Now, very quickly, you know the phrase, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. That is what is known as a chiastic structure. You're repeating it like a mirror. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. Isaiah 53, like many places in Scripture, is in a chiastic structure, which is to say A, B, C, then it repeats C, B, A. So we start with a spotlight on God in the beginning, and we'll end with a spotlight on God. What is God going to do with his suffering servant? In the middle, we get a spotlight on Israel, which represents all of us. What does Israel do? It's going to reject God's suffering servant, and then Israel is going to execute the servant, which of course we know happened 700 years later. But the middle then, the meat of it, is the middle portion. The servant suffers for us, verses 4, 5, and 6. It's just a little bit of a poetic way to get across truth, and that's how the Hebrews often wrote. Isaiah 53, verse 1. Isaiah speaking to the Lord. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord, that is a fancy way of saying the Messiah, been revealed? Answer, nobody's believed the report. No one has followed the arm of the Lord. Rebellious, sinful people. Verse 2. Why didn't we follow this guy? Well, he didn't look like anything like what we were expecting. White horse, armor, powerful, king. That wasn't what he was like at all. He grew up before him like a tender shoot, like a root out of the dry ground. We tripped over him. We thought he was a weed. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. He wasn't ruddy, handsome fellow that we were drawn to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. So yeah, of course we overlooked him. He was despised, rejected by mankind. Jesus said, birds have nests, foxes have holes. Son of man, I got no place to lay my head. A man of sorrow, familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Why did we reject him? Well, he didn't look anything like what we thought we should be looking for. He looked like some ordinary Joe Schmo. In fact, he looked pathetic. Skip ahead to Paul, 2 Corinthians 5. Paul, of course, living in the time of Christ. 700 years again after Isaiah 53 is written. Why doesn't Paul come to Christ right away? He obviously has to have this Damascus Road experience where God hits him over the head, metaphorically, with that Stasis hammer. And he has this dramatic encounter with Christ. But why doesn't he come to Christ sooner? Paul says, so from now on we regard no one from a worldly point of view. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, though I, Paul, once regarded Christ from a worldly point of view, meaning, where did he go to school? I, Paul, I got my PhD. That's why I didn't follow this Jesus guy. I was regarding him in a very worldly perspective. He was no king. I didn't think anything of him. I thought this Christian thing was a cult. Though we once regarded Christ in this way, we do so no longer. His power, his story, his coming in the name of Yahweh is overwhelming. Now we get to the heart of Isaiah 53. This is where the suffering servant, that is the Messiah, does the amazing thing. Surely he, this one we despised, took up our grief, bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by God, afflicted. He was hung on a cross. Verse 5, but he was pierced for our transgressions. What happens in crucifixion? There's a lot of piercing. Hands, feet, spear into the side of Christ. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Oh, this scandal of Christ dying isn't because he was, number one, isn't because he did anything wrong, and number two, isn't just because he was someone that we shouldn't think highly of. People thought maybe God is doing this to him. Perhaps he's done something wrong. But no, something else dramatic is going on. He is dying for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. And verse 6 sums it all up. All of us, every human being since Genesis 3 that we talked about a few weeks ago, the fall of humanity into sin, basically saying, God, thanks for the garden, tree of life, pretty awesome, but we're going to do it our own way. I mean, sure, you made the universe and all that stuff, but you know what? We're going to figure it out from here. Thanks, but no thanks. All of us, like sheep, have gone astray. We have stopped following the good shepherd that we talked about last week. Each of us has turned to our own way. And the Lord has laid on him, the suffering servant, the one we did not esteem, the one we despised. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Complete reversal, totally unexpected. 700 years before it happens. I hope you can see how easy it is to imagine the crucifixion before your very eyes, reading this passage. From this passage, we get the idea of substitute atonement. That is, Jesus becoming our substitute and atoning, that is, forgiving our sins. It should have been us, in other words, on the cross, to atone for our own sins. Instead, Jesus becomes our substitute. 2 Corinthians 5 puts it like this: he who knew no sin, that is Christ, became sin because he took on the sin of the whole world, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. It's an amazing story. Verse 7, back to Isaiah 53. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. At his trial, what did he do? Did he give a great defense of, this is why you should not crucify me? Guess what? I'm the Messiah. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shears is silent, so he did not open his mouth. You can directly go to Matthew 27. When Jesus was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer, just like Isaiah 53 just says. Then Pilate asked Jesus, don't you hear the testimony they're bringing against you? But Jesus made no reply, to the great amazement of the governor. We're about to kill you, Jesus. You might want to give a little defense of why we shouldn't. Isaiah 53 had prophesied, no. he will not open his mouth. 1 Peter, we'll talk about Isaiah 53 and Jesus. And Peter will put it like this. Jesus entrusted himself to him who loved him. He kept entrusting himself to God. Back to Isaiah 53, verse 8. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. His trial was a sham. No justice. Yet who of his generation protested? Release Jesus. No, they said release Barabbas. Who of his generation protested? No one. They said crucify him. For he was cut off from the land of the living, crucified, dead. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked. That's what you do with those who are crucified. What do you do with them? You take them down. You throw them in a big pile of bodies. In this case, though, Isaiah prophesies that Jesus will be assigned with the wicked and the rich. How is that going to work? Though he had done no violence and no deceit in his mouth. We know that Josephus, rich man, claims his body. Again, Isaiah 53. The prophecy becomes true. Ray Stedman was a pastor in California. He puts it like this. No enemy hands touched his body after his death, only those who loved him. As they removed his bloody body, the dear lips of Christ were silent. The wondrous voice was still. The light had gone from his eyes, and the great heartbeat was no more. But instead of throwing him on the rubbish heap with the wicked, they made his grave with the rich. Josephus comes along. Just as Isaiah had predicted 720 years before the event. Verse 10, back to Isaiah 53. Yet! Now this is maybe the most incredible part. First of all, first part of Isaiah 53, man, we didn't get it. This guy didn't look anything like what we thought. Despised and all that. Then he dies. He's crushed. He's pierced. And it's not because he did anything wrong, it's because of what we did. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. My goodness. And now the third part. Not only does he die for the sins of the world, he's coming back from the dead. Verse 10, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer, and though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, yet he will see his offspring and prolong his days. Resurrection. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Resurrection. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life. Resurrection. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. This is Isaiah 53. This is the mountaintop of all biblical prophecies 700 years before it happened. So clear. So what do we get from all this? What do we learn? We're about to celebrate Valentine's Day. We learn from Isaiah 53 in the life of Christ that love is sacrifice. In Jesus' case, literally, he dies for us to show us his great love. My best friend's sister, we were all at the same church, and I was getting ready to do a Valentine's Day questionnaire, I think. And she walked by my office at the church, and I said, Jennifer, come on in here. I got a question for you about Valentine's Day. She said, yeah. What is it? And I said, complete this sentence. Love is. Took her 1 second. She said, love is death. Love is death. I said, can you expound on that a little bit? Single pastor looking to get married, freaking out. Love is what again? I thought it was going to be wonderful. Love is death, Pastor Mark. This is my best friend's sister. I've known her 20 plus years. Because love is sacrifice. She was saying it a little bit more emphatically. Love is death. Love is 1,000 little deaths that you give up to be with the one you love. 1,000 little deaths. For Christ, it was one literal death. And I thought, oh, that's pretty heavy. Love is death. Okay. Pretty excited about that. But yeah, love is sacrifice. Human love is supposed to reflect Christ's love. Giving of ourselves, little deaths. That's following the path of Christ. You could say it like this: the heart of Jesus is found on the cross. Mm-hmm. Metaphorically and literally. Obviously, the real heart of Christ is on the cross. Metaphorically, the heart of Jesus is sacrifice. That is, he gave himself for us. For the joy set before him, he endured the shame of the cross. That is, what was the joy set before him? That would be you. I am going to do this because I love people that have not even been born yet. That's why he went to the cross. For you. Now, I'm going to want you to do something physically here in a few seconds. If you're able. I'm going to ask you on the count of 3 to hold your breath. Until I say breathe again. And I promise to be very, very kind and sweet. Now, if your health or whatever, obviously don't try to do this. But if you think you can hold your breath for about 10 to 15 seconds, that's right, clear your throat, get ready. On the count of 3. I'm going to keep talking, so I'm not going to hold my breath. But if you would, on the count of 3, hold your breath. 1, 2, 3. Now imagine that was the last breath you ever breathed on this earth. Would you be ready to see your Maker? Have you accepted Christ and his death on the cross for you? Because when he took his last breath, he did it for you. Breathe. Amen. Your salvation wasn't complete until Christ took his last breath. Love is death. And resurrection. Amen. That part's pretty good. That part's pretty good. Instead of crushing us for our iniquities, God crushes his suffering servant. Last verse. In Mark 10:45, Jesus says this: for the Son of Man, that is himself, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom, as a substitute for you, for many. It is through the scandal of suffering, brothers and sisters, it is through the scandal of suffering that all of us have been saved. Love indeed is sacrifice. Would you pray with me?